The situation is that Ukraine controls the vast majority of that city. There are a few hundred Russian soldiers still in the center. They are encircled. Ukraine is clearing the city at this point. These soldiers are trapped, and if they don't surrender, they'll be killed essentially. It's interesting. I think you saw a demonstration of how Putin is told a systematic kind of campaign of lies from the Russian military, because he was told that Russia captured Kupiansk, which is why he came out and made this big statement saying that Russia had captured Kupiansk, when in fact the opposite was true.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined from Kiev, Ukraine by geopolitics and security analyst Jimmy Rushton. Jimmy, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Jimmy, Ukraine has confirmed Kiev's first civilian casualties as Russian strikes reportedly killed 2 people overnight. What's the situation where you are as Ukraine comes into 2026?
So it's quite dark and it's very cold. It's -6, -7 degrees C in Kyiv today. And at the weekend, it's getting down to -17 degrees. So yeah, it's very cold. In my personal area of Kyiv, we have power for maybe 8 hours a day. At the moment, I'm running off of battery backup, which gives me some light and some internet, but no heating. So hence the jacket, because it's quite cold. Even with a few hours of heating earlier in the day, which obviously you try and max out the heat that you can accumulate in your apartment or your house for that period when you have electricity. You have all the heating going as much as possible, and hopefully that lasts for the rest of the day. But in my case, it hasn't. So.
Indeed. And speaking, we talk about these drone and missile strikes. Donald Trump has said today, finally, he's kind of come out and put this to bed. He said he doesn't believe Russia's claim that Ukraine attempted to attack Putin at his Valdai residence with a series of drones. It was a bit of an odd claim in the first place by the Kremlin, wasn't it? Do you think Russia ever thought that America would actually buy this?
I think they hoped that Trump would. And some countries, some slightly unsophisticated, you might say, in regards to their approach to Russia, countries, India, Pakistan, the UAE, they all bought it. And Russia produced no evidence for this. They produced some drone fragments, which were actually Russian drones, Russian Jabera drones, which are quite recognizable. They clearly weren't Ukrainian drones. The Ukrainians denied it. And then obviously the Americans Trump had an assessment by the CIA, which said the Ukrainians hadn't done anything of the sort, which was absolutely true. The Ukrainians hadn't done this. I mean, they'd be perfectly entitled to do so. This is a war. Russia started a war with Ukraine. They can't complain if Ukraine decides to target their top political leadership in exactly the same way that Russia has repeatedly tried to kill or kidnap Zelensky. So, yeah, it was a pretty easily debunked hoax, and even if Ukraine had have done it, which they didn't, they would have been perfectly entitled to do so anyway. Nobody would have complained if we tried to kill Hitler during World War II. The Americans took out a number of Japanese military leaders during World War II as well. It's just what happens in a war.
And where does that leave the talks at the moment that have been going on? We kind of seem to have come full circle again on this. Has there been any progress? Because Zelensky does seem to have got some sort of assurances out of Trump for what would happen if there is a peace agreement.
I think they managed to keep the Americans on side, which I think was probably the main goal of the Ukrainians going into these negotiations. I don't think they ever believed that Russia would accept anything that Ukraine could accept, or maybe even that the Americans could accept, and definitely not what the Europeans would want to accept. So they've managed to keep the Americans on side, but are we any closer to an end to this war? It's difficult to see that. The positions of the two sides are still, vastly apart. Russia wants all of Donetsk. It also probably wants, although it's not saying this explicitly for official channels, it probably wants the whole of Zaporizhia and Kherson Oblast as well, which Russians have put into their constitution as Russian territory now. So I don't think we're anywhere close to that, to be honest. I don't think we're anywhere close to the two sides being able to come to some form of agreement which would be acceptable to both sides.
Yeah, and on those areas, especially Zaporizhia, while the last round of talks was going on, we heard that order come out of the Kremlin from Putin for Russian troops to try and seize Zaporizhia itself. Is that likely to happen? I mean, where's this come from, or is this just the Kremlin still trying to put more pressure onto these talks?
I mean, they are making advances in Zaporizhia Oblast, but at the actual city of Zaporizhia, no, that's a fantasy. It's a very large city. It straddles the river Dnipro. It would be very, very difficult for Russia to take. Um, it would require, huge numbers of troops, which they really don't have. And if Ukraine was determined to defend, which they obviously would be, it would take huge amounts of casualties to take. And then, what would they gain if they take Zaporizhia? They'd almost certainly reduce it to ruins in the process. And again, it's just another ruined city, town that Russia has taken, which will never have any economic potential in Putin's lifetime. So, could they focus all their efforts in advancing towards Zaporizhia? They could, but at the moment, the main effort is in Donetsk again. So, I think it's an idle threat at the moment, but it indicates the Russian intent really, and it indicates the view that they're not just going to be satisfied with Donetsk, regardless of what they say. They want at least Kherson and Zaporizhia Oblast in their entirety, and they probably want more than that as well. They want Ukraine in its entirety, at least as a puppet state, similar to Belarus. They don't want Ukraine to be an independent entity, deciding its own foreign policy, deciding its own internal policy. They want it to be completely under the control of the Kremlin.
Another sign of that, which came alongside those orders to seize Zaporizhia city, was these orders to advance into northern Ukraine. Now, we know that had already really been going on, but there's been some... Putin has now specifically said that he wants Russian troops to take Sumy and Kharkiv regions. That's presumably the same level of almost pipe dream as trying to seize Zaporizhia in 2026.
I mean, it's even more fantastical, to be honest. Kharkiv, it's a massive city. Russia couldn't take that in years. I mean, literally. It's just not going to happen. Sumy as well. They did try and push towards Sumy, and they got, a few 10, 15 kilometers from the border, and then the Ukrainians managed to push them back. Similar in Kharkiv Oblast in 2024. They pushed into Vovchansk and to the left of Vovchansk on the other side of the river towards the north west of Kharkiv. And again, they got 10, 15, 20 kilometers from the border, but then the Ukrainians pushed them back. So what did they manage to achieve in Kharkiv? Well, they reduced a Ukrainian town, Vovchansk, to ruins again. They sacrificed, tens of thousands of Russian soldiers' lives. They did divert the Ukrainian attention, but at the same time, they diverted Russian resources, which they could have used to further their advances in Donetsk and other more probably important parts of the front. So arguably, it was a strategic mistake to open that front. They haven't really gained anything from it. And they could attempt to push further in that direction, but again, it would mean diverting forces from their main efforts, which are generally in the Donetsk Oblast.
And on the other side of the Russia-Ukraine border, Ukrainian drones have been hitting Moscow reportedly since the new year, almost daily, and today hitting more energy infrastructure within Russia. Where might Ukraine take its strikes on Russian energy infrastructure in 2026?
Yeah, they have, and they've caused blackouts in Moscow, which is kind of amazing, really, considering what the Russian views of themselves as being this massive military power, which could never, be subjected to these kind of strikes. And at the start of the war, Ukraine had no drone program. The Russians obviously purchased these long-range drones from the Iranians and started building them themselves. But the Ukrainians didn't even do that. They just started from scratch and built this drone program from nothing to, this program which launches hundreds of drones per night and takes out extremely expensive targets in Russia regularly. So I think you'll see more of the same. I think you'll see more strikes on oil facilities, refineries. I think you'll see more strikes on high-value Russian military targets. You started to see the last Q4 of last year, significant Ukrainian strikes on Russian military targets in Crimea. I mean, that had been going on for a long time, but they'd generally been focusing on radars and air defense targets. But what you saw in the last few months was they were repeatedly targeting aircraft. They were targeting fighter jets, they were targeting transport aircraft, helicopters, because they'd really degraded the Russian air defense network to the point where they could fly around Crimea with almost impunity. So I think you'll see more of this. You'll see more kind of systematic degradation of Russian air defenses. You'll see more strikes on oil refineries, infrastructure. You might see more strikes against symbolic targets around Moscow. To get through to the Russian people that this is not a war that they can kind of ignore, that this is not a war that's just happening in a faraway country. This is a war that Ukraine is bringing to their doorstep. It's a war that Russia started, but in the famous quote from Sir Arthur Bomber Harris would have said in relation to World War II, the Germans entered this war under the rather childish delusion that they were going to bomb everyone else and nobody was going to bomb them. I think that could be applied to this war. The Russians are very, very happy when they bomb Kyiv and Ukrainian targets, but they didn't think it was going to be going in the other direction. And Ukrainians are a nation of engineers. Remember, this is the country that built the largest aircraft in the world, which is unfortunately destroyed in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But, they're a country of incredibly talented, resourceful people. And, it was never just going to go one way. And I think you're seeing that. And you're seeing the collapse of Russian oil infrastructure. You're seeing the Russian economy suffering, severe pressure at the moment. And I think continued Ukrainian drone strikes will only add to that pressure. I don't think it's going to collapse the Russian economy, but I think it's going to put it under severe strain.
And it's a new year, new team for Volodymyr Zelensky. How should we read the appointment of Kirill Budanov, his former sort of head of the Secret Service, as his new chief of staff?
Yeah, so Budanov was head of GUR, which is Ukrainian military intelligence. It's an interesting appointment. He is someone that is relatively well trusted in Ukraine. He's someone that has had a pretty glittering career at GUR. And I think this is someone that Zelensky, he knew that he needed to appoint someone who was, had credibility, who was trusted by the Ukrainian people. And also someone that wasn't viewed as just another person from within his circle. And Budanov is a lot of things, but he's not a Zelensky yes man. So it's an interesting appointment. Obviously, the question is, he was doing a good job at GUR. I think it's especially strange considering the news today that the head of the SBU has also been replaced, demoted. Vasily Malyuk, who was behind the extraordinary Operation Spiderweb, which saw Russian strategic bombers targeted by hidden FPV drones. So yeah, it's a slightly strange decision to demote him whilst losing the head of Ukrainian military intelligence at the same time. So yeah, a lot of people in Ukraine are slightly puzzled by that specifically.
And he's also, interestingly, made the addition of Canadian lawmaker Chrystia Freeland as his economic development advisor. She's part Ukrainian, but it was just an interesting appointment to me because it kind of reminds us of the relatively close links between Canada and Ukraine, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Obviously, Canada has a very large Ukrainian diaspora, and they've raised a lot of money for Ukraine. Canada has supplied a lot of armed vehicles specifically to Ukraine, and they've been, very vocal in supporting the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian state generally. So yeah, it's an interesting appointment. Slightly left field again. I don't think anyone saw it coming. To be honest, not many people knew about her. She's not a big figure. She's not someone that personally had crossed my gaze before, but I'm interested to see what she can bring to this role.
And coming back to the front line in Ukraine, we'd heard before Christmas of some pretty significant tactical successes at Kupiansk for the Ukrainians, and kind of uh, counteracting claims from Kiev and Moscow about who had the advantage there. Do you know what the situation is there now?
Yeah, absolutely. The situation is that Ukraine controls the vast majority of that city. There are a few hundred Russian soldiers still in the center. They are encircled. Ukraine is clearing the city at this point. These soldiers are trapped, and if they don't surrender, they'll be killed essentially. Um, it's interesting. I think you saw a demonstration of how Putin is told a systematic kind of campaign of lies from the Russian military, because he was told that Russia captured Kupiansk, which is why he came out and made this big statement saying that Russia had captured Kupiansk, when in fact the opposite was true, that Ukraine was in the process of staging an effective counteroffensive led by Azov Corps of the National Guard and others. And yeah, they pushed the Russians back. They surrounded the remains of the Russian military that's still in the city. Russia is now trying to push some forces back into the city. They're using their standard tactic of using very small numbers of infantry, moving from cover to cover, attempting to evade detection. But at this point, it doesn't seem to be working. They've also tried to infiltrate via a pipeline again. They've done this multiple times. They stuff their guys into these old abandoned oil and gas pipelines and try and circumvent Ukrainian defenses that way. It has worked a couple of times, but the Ukrainians are generally wise to that strategy by now, and they've been keeping a close eye on all these potential points of ingress. So yeah, it's in Kupiansk. It's very much in Ukrainians' favor, and the Russians. It was very embarrassing for them because they claimed that they captured it, and then Zelensky obviously turned up, did his famous video selfie outside of the city, to the point where the Russians sent an FPV drone to strike the sign so that they could try and claim that no, Zelensky couldn't have been there because the sign looks slightly different. Well, it did look different. That's because they used a drone to blow it up. But that kind of shows that the depth of the Russian kind of cope and the Russian kind of embarrassment that Zelensky was able to do this. Because again, like I've said this multiple times, but Zelensky has a significant amount of personal bravery. He is a brave man, something which Putin absolutely is not.
And as you say, Jimmy, the main focus of Russia's offensive still very much remains in the Donbass. What is the situation out in eastern Ukraine now? It still seems to be in this sort of grinding Russian advance that is effectively still a stalemate, isn't it?
Pretty much. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily call it a stalemate because Russia is still advancing. I think it's very important to note that, but at the same time, they're advancing very slowly, and they're taking a staggering amount of casualties for the small amount of territory that they can take. So the situation in the east is relatively similar to last time we spoke, which is, again, the Russians are making small advances. They're using small infantry tactics. They're pushing up small numbers of troops. These troops try to evade detection. They are told not to engage the Ukrainians, but what they do is they try and build up a kind of critical mass of personnel, at which point they then can engage. And this tactic is effective largely because Ukraine is still struggling with infantry. It just doesn't have enough infantry to effectively secure the front line, and they are using drones and unmanned systems to try to negate some of this deficiency. But a drone really cannot hold territory. You need men on the ground in foxholes, in bunkers to do that, and that is what they're struggling with at the moment. So it's difficult, but it's not catastrophic, and the cold temperatures actually help the Ukrainians because the Ukrainians are on the defensive. They're sitting in their relatively warm bunkers, whereas the Russians are having to advance over open territory. There's no concealment really because the trees have lost all the foliage. The ground is very, very hard, which means that when a munition lands, it generally has more of an effect because it when there's mud, the shell or whatever can essentially dig in, and the explosive effect, the shrapnel effect, can be slightly negated by that. So it's a pretty difficult, hellish time for a Russian assault trooper. But then, when was it ever not? It's always been, a particularly miserable and short lifespan being a Stormovik in the Russian military.
And of course, on the world stage, the big event in geopolitics that is, I mean, sucking all the oxygen out of the room is Venezuela. There were some stern words from Trump for Vladimir Putin as he made the announcement about his snatching of Maduro. How are the Russians going to read what's gone on in Venezuela? Because they were sort of an ally of Venezuela. There was some level of trade going on between them at some point in the past. Are they going to be worried about this, or are they actually going to be thinking, well, if the Americans can do it, we'll have another go?
I mean, they absolutely were a regional ally of the Russians. That's beyond question. There were a number of agreements between Russia and Venezuela. Russia was supplying Venezuela with weapons. Didn't have a particularly good impact on the American operation to kidnap or arrest Maduro, depending on how you view that. But yeah, no, I mean, from Moscow's perspective, this is what they wanted to do in Kyiv in 2022. They wanted to stage this kind of lightning fast airborne operation using the VDV to, come into Kyiv, quickly seize the, centers of power, take Zelensky if possible, and, do what the Americans did in Venezuela. But they can't, because they're not the Americans. So I think for the Russians, it's a little bit embarrassing because they've lost another regional ally. They lost Syria the year before last, sorry. The Iranian regime has been severely weakened through Israeli and American airstrikes, and now they've lost Venezuela. So I think for the Russians, being a Russian regional ally doesn't really look that attractive right now, because you get subpar military equipment. You don't really get any diplomatic protection. Okay, if you're an African country, they might send you Wagner or the Africa Corps, as they're now called. And they might, help you, protect your corrupt dictatorship. But if you're, a serious country, if you're Venezuela, if you're Syria, if you're in Iran, for example, they're not going to really do that much when Uncle Sam or Israel comes a knocking.
And just as we're speaking at this time, as we're speaking, President Maduro has pled not guilty in a U.S. New York courtroom. What do you make of his arrest as an expert on geopolitics, Jimmy? Where does this leave the U.S. and the rest of the world after what's gone on over this weekend?
I mean, it's a little bit farcical. Look, I have no love for Maduro, but it's kind of strange seeing him being one of the indictments, as far as I am aware, is that he was in possession of machine guns, which is very strange because surely possessing a machine gun in Venezuela, if you're a Venezuelan citizen, isn't necessarily legal. You're surely not subject to US jurisdiction if you're a Venezuelan citizen in Venezuela, owning a machine gun. So it's very strange. I mean, obviously the drugs charges, that's something separate. I haven't personally reviewed that evidence, so maybe there's a slam dunk case. I'm slightly skeptical. But at the same time, this is Maduro welcomed the Russian invasion of Ukraine, fulsomely welcomed the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I'm sorry, if you're happy to see Russia invading a democratic country for no reason at all, you can't complain when the Americans do that to you. If you want the law of the jungle, you're going to have to live with tigers, and that's what he's discovering to his, displeasure right now.
Well, indeed, Jimmy, and I think we will continue discussing at some future point some of these tigers of geopolitics. But Jimmy Rushton, geopolitics and security analyst, thank you very much for joining me today on Frontline.
Thank you for having me.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, or you can also sign up for a membership where you'll get exclusive content and access to videos earlier than you would otherwise. And remember, for the latest news and analysis, you can read The Times at thetimes.com, or you can listen to Times Radio. And if you want to hear more from Frontline, you can also hear us in podcast form. Just look for Times Radio's Frontline wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks very much. Goodbye.